Hello, welcome to Stories in Time. My name is Ellouise Schoettler. I'm a storyteller. A lot of times people come up to me and they will say, "Where did you get those stories?" Some I found in a book, if I were doing folk tales or other stories that have been published and are out there. You find those in books. Most of the work that I do is like a memoir, or it's a memory. And so I have to look inside to find the story. I may have forgotten it. I may not have realized that something interesting did happen. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about that, wondering whether or not you want to tell your stories and you want to tell your stories about your life. I think those are fascinating, and we all live in stories. And so I'm just going to tell you a couple of things that I'm doing as I develop new stories. Well, it started the other day, actually. I began to think about what I was going to tell today. And I thought, well, I'm doing some memoir writing, trying to remember stuff. And I just stay with that because it was helping me with another project. And how did I get to Baltimore? I looked at a chart that I have with stories I have told, and it says, "On my way to Baltimore." Why did I go to Baltimore? What in the world? How did I find out that I was going to go to Baltimore? Those are good questions to ask yourself when you wake up and you've been someplace and you can't remember exactly why you went there. I was a senior in high school in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the counselor called me into her office. And she said, "I have your files here. We need to talk about what you're going to do when you graduate." "What do you mean, what I'm going to do when I graduate? I'm happy with here. I haven't done anything to think about what I'm going to do." Well, of course, that was pretty foolish. And she started talking to me about, your records are pretty good. You've done well with your grades. You have some possibilities. Well, I said, "Well, what are the possibilities?" This was 1954. I was a 17-year-old girl. What were the opportunities at that time for a 19-year-old female in the future? What jobs? So she said, "What have you been thinking about? There are possibilities. You can go to college." Well, I cast that off right away because I knew that my parents did not have the money to send me to college, and we stepped over that. She said, "We have good secretarial schools in Charlotte, Ellouise, and the cost of those are much less than going to college or living away from home." And I thought, well, no living away from home. So I said, "Well, isn't there something else that I could do besides going to college to be, what would I be if I go to college?" "Well, you could be a teacher, or you could be a librarian." And I thought, well, what else is there out there for me other than being a teacher or a librarian if I could go to college, which I don't think I can go to college. And she said, "Well, then you could be a secretary." I said, "I'm not going to be a secretary. My mother's been a secretary all of her life since she started having jobs, and she doesn't appear to be, she likes it, but she's not too happy with it." And so what were we going to do? And I said, "There must be something else for somebody like me." And she said, "You could be a nurse." I could be a nurse. Well, I had been a candy striper at Presbyterian Hospital, taking people desserts and things and getting them magazines and being in a hospital. I liked that. I liked being helpful. I liked taking care. I liked being in a hospital. It made me feel like I could do something to help people. But I didn't want to be at the Presbyterian Hospital 6 blocks from where I lived. And I didn't want to go to Mercy Hospital, which was where I was born, and was only about a half a mile from where I lived. And that was not leaving home. So I said, "I want to be a nurse, and I'll go to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, to be a nurse. She looked startled. I looked startled. I only thought that up because my grandfather always talked about Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore because he was from Baltimore. And he had a relative that was a surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And Dad Jack talked about it all the time as being one of the greatest places in the world. So why not reach for the stars? That's how I decided to become a nurse. Now, did that go through? Well, this was 1954. I went to Baltimore. I was in nurses training, and then I met a medical student who was my prince, and he was my prince for 57 years. That was a good move on my part, but I didn't finish my nurses training, and many other women did that too. You know, that we knew that we had to find something to do while we were waiting to get married. Now, that's not the case today, but that was the case for women at one time. Actually, what happened to me is I had 3 children and I went back to college when I was 30 years old in Washington, D.C., and graduated with my degree and then went to graduate school. So I was in my 30s when that happened for me. 18 years old was a little young for me to make all those decisions. So in the story that I make about going to Baltimore, I had to figure out where would that start? Where, if I was going to tell that story, where does that start? I decided on one version that I would start just as I just have. I would tell you what the counselor said to me at age 17 in 1954 at Central High School in Charlotte, North Carolina. What were my options? It's good to think about, isn't it? What were my options then? And how was I going to do that? So I was starting this story, that version of it, in Charlotte, talking with the counselor and sort of doing a little study about, did I want to be a teacher? Did I want to be a librarian? Did I want to be a secretary? Or did I want to be a nurse? None of which I had chosen to think about all by myself. That's one place to start. And so I just told you that in the beginning. Well, by September, it was time for me to go to Baltimore. One evening, my family took me to the train station in Charlotte because the Southerner going to Baltimore left Charlotte at midnight, in the dark at midnight. I got really dressed up because that was the practice at that time. I had on little high heels and gloves, and I was carrying a black patent leather pocketbook. And of course, as you can imagine, by the next morning, I looked like a wreck. My grandmother had given me some instructions. I had never been anywhere, and certainly not anywhere by myself. And so she told me who she was an experienced traveler. And she told me what to do when I got to the stations, Baltimore. She didn't think about the fact that we were going to stop in Washington, D.C. What I would see and that, what I should do and how I should handle with the baggage and all of this kind of thing. I made sure that I had the address, the letters from Hopkins saying you can come, and the address for the nurses' home. That's what I would give the taxi man to take me. I had never ridden in a taxi where I got in it, had the money, and told him where to take me. That's pretty scary, actually. When you're leaving home, your parents are standing out on the platform, and you're in the train that sways and begins to move forward. And you can see them out the window. Your mom and daddy, your grandmother, your sisters, your family standing there waving goodbye to you, and it feels kind of like I'll never see them again. That night, I sat down in my chair near the window, next to the window, actually. I couldn't see very much. I could think a lot, couldn't see very much, could think about. And that was a long night, a long night. And about 7:30, we rolled into Washington, D.C., and they called out, the conductor called out that we were stopping at the train station downtown, and we would be there for 45 minutes before we were going to go on to Baltimore. Get off, walk around, you know, go to shopping if you want to, but get back on this train on time. We don't wait for people. I was so excited. I had my seat. I was all set. I checked my pocketbook. What could happen? So I got down, and it was a long walk into the station here. I'd never been in one of these big stations for the trains. Ours in Charlotte was just one of those that the train rides through, and you have just a long, narrow building where the seats are, and you can go in there and go to the bathroom or sit in the seats. That was it. But when I pushed the doors open to walk into Union Station downtown in Washington, D.C., I could hardly catch my breath. In 1954, that ceiling just reached up to the skies. It was the biggest room I had ever been in my life, with more people than I had ever been in my life. Who had been to school or seen books that had told me to prepare that you were going into a building that was built like the Baths of Caracalla in Rome, which I did later go to in the 70s. And that was as breathtaking as walking in to Union Station in Washington. I went to the mini toilets bathroom, and then I looked around in the big room and into the little shops and everything, and I kept looking. My grandparents had given me a little silver watch that also had a second hand, because I was going to be a nurse. I mean, they didn't think ahead that one of those little teeny watches, you can't even see it. So I had to go to the drugstore and get a watch that had a big face on it and that you could see the second hand moving around. Otherwise, I could never count a pulse. That's how you begin to learn things. And the reason I'm telling you about that is that's how you start a story. Until I started working with this today, I knew that story. I lived that story. There's a lot more that goes along with that story, but then you begin to want to add details. And so I tried to put myself back on the station, the platform in Charlotte, September 1954. I tried to imagine myself relive those moments when I got off the train in Baltimore. Nervous to Pete. Just my hands were shaking. What if I didn't get back on the train? Where would I go? I didn't know anything about these towns. So you want to bring back the feeling of being there. The people, the way that they looked when I saw them. The rush as the doors opened going down to the tracks, and that if you got into that, I felt pushed because there were so many people. That really, in my mind, is what makes the story. How can you set it up so that the people can go back with you? Because what they'll want to do is they'll go with you a little while to your story, but they're really beginning to remember and to work on their story. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Gathering your stories to share with friends, with family, with your grandchildren. That's what it's all about. What does dinner taste like? What does it smell when it's on the stove in the kitchen? Catch it any place you can. And believe you me, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. I hope you'll take some time to just test it on yourself and then tell us about your story. Tell people about the story. Thank you for listening. It's fun to have a chance to talk about that and to hope that I'm telling somebody a tip that will help them tell their story.